As we reach the peak of hurricane season, we know many of you are keeping a close eye on anything that forms in the tropics. Since Hurricane Barry in 2019, southern Louisiana has spent 43 and a half days in the cones of uncertainty. The KATC weather team wants you to be informed and prepared.
The seasonal forecast said 2 or it said 50. I'm still as prepared and take the exact same precautions every single season.
The weather team has a look at what we've learned from previous years, plus new technology to keep you and your family safe.
This is kind of the initial building block toward having public consumption of forecasts that are incredibly accurate and allow us to make informed decisions.
And how hurricanes can affect you long after the storm has passed.
And so now we get anxious when it just starts to rain because we remember all of the trauma at the same time.
From the KATC Weather Lab, this is a KATC special presentation, Weathering the Storm.
Thanks for joining us. Many of you have been through more than one storm during your time in Acadiana. We want you to go beyond the normal preparations for a hurricane, to take a look at the lessons learned from previous storms like Barry, Laura, Delta, and Ida.
And that way you and your family can be as prepared as possible when another hurricane threatens. We also know many of you have a bit of PTSD when it comes to these types of events. And we're going to share with you what you can do now to help keep the anxiety down.
A main part of helping you, your family, and your friends not be so anxious when a storm is approaching is to be prepared. There are several things that you can do now so that you aren't rushing around at the last minute.
That includes making sure you have your plan in place. Be sure to check in with your insurance agent now before a storm enters the Gulf of Mexico. That way you know what is covered in case you have damage. Now is also the time to get your hurricane kit together. That includes having enough water, food, and medications for at least a week. Don't forget to pack extra clothes as well.
And don't forget your pets. Be sure to include extra pet food, bowls, water, medications for your four-footed friends. If you evacuate to a shelter, they need to be in a carrier.
And joining us now is Deputy Director and Acting Director of the National Hurricane Center, Jamie Rome. Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. You know, with that many directors in your title, you know, hopefully I can say something intelligent.
Yeah, well, we'll work on that, and we'll get you down to one director at some point, we hope. That's for sure. So first question I have, Jamie, is what's new coming out of the National Hurricane Center for 2022 that we can look for as operational meteorologists and perhaps the public as well?
Yeah, we're continuing our thrust in improving our communication and visualization of storm surge. So we're going to make some upgrades to one of the storm surge products that we released last season, an experimental product where we sort of denoted the amount of storm surge along the coastline and 4 to 5 feet, 3 to 4 feet, that sort of thing. We're going to actually make it colorize it this year and color code it based off the increasing threat. So the warmer or the brighter the colors, the higher the risk of impactful storm surge.
And could you comment about, actually, I know you originally came from the storm surge unit and you were heading up that group. What about the storm surge forecast and their accuracy today as compared to just say 5 years ago? And I know you guys took a lot of flack, especially for Hurricane Laura, where you were talking about an unsurvivable storm surge, and you may have used the same term in Ida as well. You got flack for that, but the storm surge forecast verified, and there were actually reduced number of deaths associated with those surges.
Yeah, in the case of Laura, we actually have a measured storm surge of 18 feet above ground level. Now, I'm about 6 feet tall, so that's three times my height. But more impressively, we measured the rise or the rate of rise in the water at 10 feet in a single hour. So imagine the ocean elevating 10 feet in a single hour. I've never observed or seen anything that fast in my 23 years at the Hurricane Center. And that's what contributed to the harsh language. But thankfully, we don't know of any fatalities despite that horrific storm surge, nor do we know of any examples of people needing to be rescued after the storm. So that implies that within the hardest hit Cameron Parish, a fair number of people heard that message and got out.
And yeah, and that seemed to be the incredible, that rise inside of an hour of a 10-foot surge. This is why we tell people get out of that storm surge at all costs. You look at storms like Ida, Laura, Delta, these major storms that did tremendous amounts of wind damage well inland, and of course we're tackling this surge situation, but a lot of the emergency preparedness guys in the 90s and the early 2000s say flee from the water but not from the wind. But you look at a hurricane like Laura, 100 miles inland, we had gusts over 100 and tremendous amounts of damage. What's your advice when we're up against the wall with these major storms? Do you advise evacuation even, say, at the I-10 corridor level or further inland, or do you defer to the local emergency preparedness guys on that?
We're always going to defer to the local emergency management because in some cases, if a home is not manufactured strong enough to endure the wind stress, then in that case, that might be an evacuation situation. But in general, if your home is engineered strong enough to sustain the winds and you're not in a flood area, you're not at flood risk, you may impart more risk on yourself by trying to leave, because especially if you're leaving at the last minute, you're caught in traffic jams and that sort of thing. But what we have to help people understand is when that's from the direct impact of the storm. So people are doing a really good job protecting themselves during that first wave as the hurricane moves through. But then we're seeing people sort of let down their guard after the hurricane passes. And they're starting to drive around in flooded waters. This is where we're seeing the drownings. And they're starting to overexert themselves, often in the heat. And we're seeing lots of heat-borne illnesses, heat strokes. And then they're desperately trying to use generators without setting them up appropriately or safely. And that's where we're seeing the uptick in our carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yeah, and that, seems to be the trend of the last several years. Speaking of the last several years, I was at the American Meteorological Society broadcast conference, and I actually presented a talk about Louisiana being in the cone of uncertainty. Going back to Hurricane Barry in 2019 through 2020 and 2021, we were in the cone of uncertainty in southern Louisiana for 43 and a half days. Now, we know that cone is getting smaller. The forecast accuracy on where these storms are making landfall seems to be really improving, and there's been a great job over the years. But we still have a lot of work to do from what we understand about intensity forecasting and trying to get the intensity of a hurricane even a day before it makes landfall. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the intensity has traditionally been the Achilles heel of hurricane forecasting. And by intensity, I'm talking about the peak winds, how strong the winds are in the storm. But in the last couple of seasons, there's been hope in the form of new science and technology that has enabled us to not only do a better job of predicting intensity, but to see these so-called rapid intensifiers. And these are the storms that just rapidly, in a span of a few hours, jump several Saffir-Simpson scale intensity, just really ramp up almost overnight.
Now, I want to ask you about this. Looking back at the recent hurricanes, such as Harvey in 2017, Michael in 18, Laura in 20, Ida in 2021, all of those storms underwent rapid intensification cycles in the Gulf of Mexico. 48 hours beforehand, they were tropical depressions, or even less in the case of Harvey. Are we seeing more rapid intensification cycles, and specifically in the Gulf of Mexico, because we have seen these three Category 4s and a Category 5 in those several years? Are we seeing something like that? Do you have a feel for something like that?
There is some early evidence to suggest that rapid intensification or storms that rapidly intensify are more likely in our changing climate. So it's a little early to say definitively like that's absolute, but there is some suggestion in the last couple of seasons would actually give you indication that is in fact happening.
Yeah, that goes to my next question. We expect a hurricane in southern Louisiana once every 5 to 8 years, a Category 3, a major storm. The long-term averages were once every 25 to 30 years, depending on your location in southern Louisiana. but we've really beaten those long-term statistical odds easily over the last 5 years. So is there a new paradigm with the Gulf of Mexico being 4 degrees warmer than the late 20th century average? Are we seeing the heat content in the Gulf help this, or has it just been an unlucky cycle and we also have a little extra heat to work with?
I think it's the latter, an unlucky cycle. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of that bad news. You've just had a string of bad luck. There is some science, the science on whether or not hurricanes are going to increase in frequency as we march through in a changing climate is still a bit unknown, still being debated a little bit. And so, the best shot right now is that the numbers are relatively unchanged. But what I can tell you is that the storms that are occurring are packing a harder and harder punch. They're a little bit stronger, they're a little bit wetter, and they're producing a little bit more storm surge. And all that means is when they hit your community, they hit harder. And Louisiana has certainly felt that. I mean, you've been hit multiple times very, very hard. And so you're kind of, starting to see these storms that punch below the belt a bit harder.
We've been looking at these hurricane seasonal forecasts going back over the last 3 years for 2020, 2021, and 2022, and they're all very similar. So 2020, we had a big forecast for a lot of storms, a lot of hurricanes. 2021, similar, and this year it seems the metrics are the same or just as good as the last 2 years. But these hurricane seasonal forecasts talk about activity in the entire Atlantic basin, but it's all about impacts and where the storms make landfall, correct?
Yeah, so we can predict overall activity with a fair bit of accuracy, and unfortunately the prediction and all indications are for another active season. But we don't know where their storms are going to go. So we know we're going to have a lot of storms, but we don't know until they form, what part of the country they're going to impact. And so at a local level, at an individual level, at a community level, we can have a very busy season and little or no impacts, or the opposite of that is you can have a really quiet season, and if a storm hits you, for you, that's a busy season.
Jamie Rome, thank you so much. Deputy Director and Acting National Hurricane Center Director. Hopefully we won't see too much of you in the months ahead, but here's to hoping that it's a relatively easy season and maybe we have more of those out to sea storms. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with us here at KATC and for Acadiana. We really appreciate your efforts, and good luck in the months ahead.
Thank you for having us.
Cutting-edge technology that may help keep you and your family safe from a storm. How buoys may be able to help better predict hurricanes next.